It's the SDG Podcast. Before we get started, you can check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com/podcast or find us on all the social medias, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.
All right. Another day, another podcast. Hello, podcasters. How about you say hello, introduce yourselves before we dig into the topic and introduce our special guest.
Peter, you usually go first.
I do? I'm Peter Lawrence.
Chad went first.
I think that's probably true. I'm Chad Jetner. Hello.
And I'm Kyle Bacher, and joining us today is one of our fantastic QA professionals, QA automation specialists, experts. I know she blew me away in about 5 minutes when we did security training with her knowledge. And thank you for joining us, Akila Kavo.
Pleasure to be here.
First time on the SDG podcast, but podcast many times before and has done presentations and all sorts of things. So Akila, thanks for being here.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but you are now the SDG solution lead QA automation. Did I get that right?
Yeah. And kind of quality in general. I know on the slide we just threw up just kind of automation and whatnot, but yeah, I kind of focus on all domains of quality, from quality engineering to kind of the quality expert strategy and ownership parts of it as well too. So yeah, now I'm a solution lead for SDG, and very excited to start lending my expertise there to kind of, help out on kind of the whole practice.
Excellent. Awesome. So my history, I came from kind of SharePoint consulting, where I'm more of a builder, configurator, like not a coder. And I only think I had one project where we had a QA person, built test cases, things like that. And that was a long time ago. I have no idea how that would be automated in today's world. So can you just give me a quick kind of description on what QA automation means?
Sure. I mean, gosh, that can be such a broad question because it can really fit so many different things for trying to accomplish so many different tasks. When we're talking about quality in general, it's not just one type of test that will end up running. It'll be tests for saying how performant is what we're doing and does it meet our criteria for that. That's a non-functional requirement we'll be validating. But there's also the functional things of it, like this is what our users need out of it and this is what we expect out of it. Is it meeting that criteria? And then there's going to be also different levels of your tests at that. So it's like, are we testing it at the component level where we're testing it in isolation, or are we going to be testing it end to end, running it through an integration? So when we talk about automated testing and what that looks like, it really depends on the system. I've worked on Bluetooth controllers that then connect to AV cameras and then testing that the video feed actually pulls back. And that's all very hardware specific stuff, and the testing architecture looks very different, but the strategy at the end of the day looks the same. Identifying, are we testing right now just at the component level? Are we doing full integrations of the whole system? And, kind of tailoring the solution to that.
So you're just kind of like water. You just shape yourself to whatever you need to be testing and then figure out how you can automate that.
And that's been for a lot of very difficult stuff. SAP has been one. I don't want to go back into that, but SAP is a difficult one to one. I've also done some green screen applications using some visual-based testing tools. And those are also awful and very difficult to get really well maintained. But like IBM AS400 Advantech system, it's all coded in RPG. I was able to get some automation running with that, but it took a while.
I was really hoping that we would get an unfiltered opinion from Akila, and I'm so disappointed that we're not. It's hard to determine. So I think Akila, specifically what we want to talk about is so we got automated testing, and we've got tools like Cypress and like all the automation tools. All of that stuff is great. What would be cool to talk about is what's the next generation? Like, what's the next iteration? What's on the horizon for a lot of these tools? And what are you excited about?
Yeah, for sure. Talking just about the automation space, I mean, automation patterns are having to evolve just as coding patterns in the development world are. Back in the 2000s, when automation was just getting started off, everything looked a lot different on websites. Everything was generally a lot more paginated, and it was kind of siloed like that. But now most workflows are getting to be a lot more complicated, and you're not going to have necessarily a single page for something. You'll have nested components that are reaching through multiple different things. So one of the biggest changes architecture-wise that we're seeing is people starting to abandon page object model, which has been the standard use case that people have been using for organizing selectors in test logic, to adopt new types of architectures like component object model, where you're instead scoping it to the components that feed into the pages, or different patterns like screenplay pattern, where instead you're trying to write your test cases around kind of a screenplay where you have an actor doing a thing to get an end goal, and then kind of writing your test cases and organizing your logic around those workflows, kind of based around a user in a screenplay versus instead of a page.
Wait a minute. You still have to write test cases? I thought automation got you away from all of that kind of stuff, that it would just magically happen.
And I mean, there is a few places trying to tackle that. One of the big things that a few companies are doing is how can we automate test cases, and how can we speed up that process? And I think that that's kind of taking a wrong step to solve the problem. One of the big problems we have in the industry is like we have a lack of quality experts that really have the expertise to really know how to build a well thought out strategy. And there's definitely a need, because over the past 25 years, we've seen the same rate of software projects failing and succeeding, which has been, around like 25% meeting their original goals, with over half of them ending up costing nearly twice as much as they originally budgeted. That's just fact and what it's been for the past 25 years. So there's a need for quality, and it's not necessarily that we need to write more test cases. We need to get more value out of the test cases. We need to quantify what's actually coming out of that. So, I mean, if you have any specific questions on kind of what some current tools are in the marketplace and how they're approaching that and how I think that that's going to evolve later on, I could definitely go on for a while about that.
I would love to hear a little bit more about that, because I know that, a lot of times some people are sort of take the approach that test cases are something you don't need with automation, or you don't need with other kind of manual testing. It's just, well, those are for the specialized QA people, and they do those test cases stuff. And we just do simple, we just kind of know how it's supposed to work, and we test that. And that gets to be frustrating especially when you bring in a QA expert and they're like, show me your test cases. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of the big problems that most places are trying to solve now, is like, how do we strike the balance of making the work going between our quality experts, who are like the manual testers that really know the processes, they really know the subject matter, and how do we pair those with the quality engineers, whether those are people on the dev team or just quality analysts that just have really good technical skills building the automation tools? How do we make both of their work more synchronous, and how can we build that understanding better so that way they know what tests have been built? How can we get that traceability? And so there's been a few ways that the industry has been trying to tackle that. One of them is through the design of the methodologies they go about developing software. So adopting technology or methodologies like test-driven development or behavior-driven development as an extension of that. You're solving that with design by saying, first, we're going to define the tests and tie those to requirements. That's part of the traceability thing there. So then you're limiting the amount of code you're developing, and you're tying that to a test based on definition. You're saying that we're only going to code off of the tests, and we're going to code to make this test pass, and that's going to give us the least amount of functional code we need to get this end goal. Right. Behavior-driven development is just taking a step above that to say we want these tests, but we want to have these tests mean something. So how do we put a person to them to do something to get an action? That's following screenplay pattern. Other ways that people have been approaching it, like some current AI testing tools that are out there, do things like monitoring your server logs. They're taking a more code-based approach for trying to solve this problem. They'll monitor your production server logs, and then they'll build a bunch of test cases that follow what your users are doing. They'll try and throw in some synthetic data to generalize that, and they'll pump out 5,000 test cases, and then they'll run, and over time, some of them will fail, and you still have that same original problem that, like, okay, we have these test cases, but what do they do? What value does it mean if this fails and this one passes? And how do we start really digging into the details of that to really understand, well, is this even a valid scenario to begin with? Because when we start looking at all these things, there's a lot of different requirements that could be broken. Is it a functional requirement of something not meeting how we're trying to originally have this work? Is it a problem with the code not being efficient enough or having a deficiency there? Or is it a environment issue or data, how we're implementing the solution? It could be all of these different things, and all of these different solutions are kind of filling in one of those holes. It's plugging in one of those things, but it really doesn't solve systematically kind of the whole approach.
Yeah, kind of, Chad, like you're used to when a unit test fails, you just comment out that test, right? And then your code's fine.
I mean, that there's an annotation called ignore, right? And it's super, super easy. And it really takes me like 5 seconds to fix a unit test.
Right.
If I take a drink of water in between typing. So yeah, I agree with Akila. Like it's tough to realize. So we have, like, most of my projects I work on, we at the end of the project we end up with and we do kind of test driven development, right? We write tests first, but
and
so
also
we, at the end
last.
of the, yeah, kind of sometimes, Peter. I will end up with, thousands of tests, right? And every build takes 25 minutes, 30 minutes because, hey, we got to run the tests and we got to do this, we got to do that. And then one test fails and then the entire build fails, right? And that's probably, I think the point Akila was trying to get at was like, is that valuable, right? Is it, you necessarily need that level of coverage all the time? Or do you need that amount of consequence every time something fails, right?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Go look at it. But I mean, if you're having to fix a capitalization thing in your string utils class, is it the end of the world, right? Like, why'd you write that test to begin with? What problem are you actually solving by writing that? I haven't found a good equilibrium yet. I'm still defaulting to make sure they all pass, make sure everything succeeds before you push anything anywhere. That feels comfortable to me. And I know generally when I feel comfortable, there'll be something wrong, right? Because I'm not learning, I'm not getting better at it, blah, 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 right?
And as a developer,
yeah.
if you don't run the test and check something in, then you may or may not get caught, right? And so you get into those patterns of, well, I didn't get caught the last 3 times, so I must be doing it right.
Yeah, I mean, if so, here's general rule that I usually implement is if you leave and you broke the build, right? And breaking the build for us usually means you committed code, you didn't run the tests locally, you pushed it anyway. They broke, it didn't deploy, somebody else has to fix your thing. That guy is the guy that pays for a round at happy hour, right? And it's a goofy little thing that we do, but it is incredibly effective. So I like having them all in there because I get so many free drinks out of it because so many people break the build.
They're not learning very fast. Yeah. So Akila, I mean, we're talking about sort of the developer side, unit testing, and your side is more after that, or both?
I view my step as kind of making sure that all of this is tailored, because I see it really as kind of 4 distinct levels of testing that get split into 2 separate groups kind of for how you manage that. And what you're talking about right now is a lot of kind of the feature testing stuff that we end up doing that's active stuff that gets done in our sprints or, whatever cadence we're ending up running on. That stuff that we're doing associated to our work and is validating the kind of output of the work that we're doing. And so that is the unit testing, which is at the smallest, most granular level. And then the component testing, which is taking those, groups, putting them together to get one block of functionality. So some unit tests might be, does this API give a 200 response for this requirement? Does it give a 400 for this one if it's, et cetera? But then when we start building those units together and then putting the UI component on top of it, and now it's an active search bar, I can still stub out the inputs and outputs and all that. We're testing it in isolation, but now it is a component of combined functionality of units. We still want to have that as, something that we can put in a pipeline as a build event thing that we can trigger. But it's still focused on testing things in isolation, and it's small in scope, something that we can run in a container if we need to. It can run headless, and it's really focused on just making sure that at the most granular level, what we're defining as like our how requirements, our what requirements of like what needs to happen. This, input needs to give this response, etc. Can meet those. Second level of testing kind of sits above that, which is the acceptance layer of testing. And that stuff is kind of what I view, so that first stuff we talked about, that's all test-driven development. The second layer is kind of what I feel really exemplifies behavior-driven development, because you're then starting to tie those to business requirements of like how this provides value to the business versus this happens when I put in this input, or this happens when I fill out this stuff. It is a different way of looking at it that then we can start to associate personas to. a certain type of user. Like this is a formulary user that has to sign in to get access to this particular business rule. So once you start setting the guide rails for that, you can start to then design your test cases in a manner that you're defining the application state, the entrance and exit points for going through that, and you can start to manage more complex workflows that have those integrations because you're kind of defining the guardrails of like the application state around that. And you're using kind of ubiquitous language, using BDD tools like Gherkin and things like that to like have an easy way of communicating that across the team so everyone can be on board with that. Those acceptance tests you run a lot less frequently, and those happen at like the big quality check-ins. So like we're doing our integrations, we're like merging code branches, we're about to do a feature release. We'll kick off the feature acceptance suite, that is all the test cases that our quality experts have said is our list of things that we want to make sure that the feature works. Okay. Once that passes and that merges to main and it goes to the QA environment or whatever, etc., we can then run the full regression acceptance suite, and that happens like once on like a release instead of having to do that on every developer commit. You're identifying where along the lines the importance of the testing is and executing it at that point. So you don't need to have a full regression test on every developer commit. First off, it's unit tests. It then gets to the dev integration environment. All the components work sweet. We can automatically kick that to the QA environment, and then the QAs can then start doing the stuff that they need to do. So that way you can just have a pipeline that has filters looking for specific things and filtering out something small to be as short as possible to get to what you need to.
I'm hearing, as you're describing all of this, like different roles that would plug in, user research, business analysis, requirements gathering, all that kind of stuff. What kind of team do you have to build? Like, are you going out? And I'm guessing sometimes you are going out by yourself and being the QA on the project.
Yeah.
On larger projects, like, how do you tie in with that group? What does that group look like? What does your team look like?
For sure. That typically has the average three amigos of like a product or business analyst type role, a QA type role, and a developer type role. And if you have somebody senior enough in each of those kind of disciplines sitting at the table, you can kind of accomplish this from like a refinement point of view. And if you have the processes set up well enough around it, and you can, and I've done this with, Azure, and I've done this with Jira, and kind of like whatever you'd like to do, you can kind of make the processes more conducive to kind of let the rest of the work flow through. You're defining the ways that you're grooming those refinements, or you're refining those requirements, and you set the kind of like those three at the beginning to kind of make sure that everything's accounted for. But really, that's kind of all it takes. And I don't like to necessarily say like, okay, we have to have a business analyst, we have to have a product owner, we have to have exactly one manual QA and 3 automated QA. Because a lot of the times, each of those individuals has a different skill set depending on which business analyst you pick or which QA person you pick. Even in like just the QA space, there is no really 2 QA that are the same because most of them have come from, self-development through just kind of doing the work that they've been doing. So a lot of the times I look to more define the roles really well that the people will fit in and make sure that those work all well together. And then really it's up to the team to pick up and start running with those. Like an example of this is like, I don't say that there should be a DevOps person that's in charge of like maintaining all the pipelines and tying the test results to the builds. That should be a responsibility owned by the team. And whether that is somebody that is a developer that picks that up or somebody on the QA team that just happens to really like pipelines, anybody I feel could really do that independent of their role. Just if they have the skill set, it's kind of a team responsibility that just is an activity that needs to get done.
That's an interesting way to look at it. It's sort of the productization of the team is we have this thing that needs to be done. I don't really care who does it, but let's make sure somebody does it.
Yeah.
Otherwise we're in trouble.
It's documented and it's easy enough to understand, and like the inputs and the outputs of that for each of those steps is well enough to find that anybody can pick it up.
Earlier, did you say there was a tool called a Gherkin?
So yeah. So that's Gherkin syntax, and that is a specific way of writing or documenting down test cases. And that is like the given, when, then syntax. And there's a few different tools that utilize that syntax. In the open source world, it's Cucumber. In the Microsoft stack, it's SpecFlow.
Okay. I heard that.
I'm feeling a theme here. Gherkins and cucumbers, and so you're in a pickle. and you got to get out, you need to QA and use those tools. Thank you. I'll be here all week. Tip your bartenders.
So, Akila, we kind of touched on this earlier a tiny bit, but using generative AI to help with writing test cases. Have you had experience with that? Have you seen it yet?
Yeah. So that one company that I had mentioned was doing generative off of looking at server logs, but other large companies are kind of looking at that as well too. Microsoft, their research center at Cambridge, recently put out a tool called Bug Lab that is a Python-based implementation that they describe as a self-supervised bug detection and repair tool. And they published a white paper last year that essentially detailed out 19 new defects that they were able to find in open source Python packages by essentially using this tool that was essentially kind of using some of these generative coding, large language models and things like that to go and scan through open source Python libraries to find defects. And they were actually able to get 19 logged against stuff. So that's one way that some big companies are picking up and starting to use it, is they're trying to use that to kind of just comb over different codes. Facebook also internally published a tool called GetAFix, that is kind of trying to do the same thing, that developers can use it to implement code fixes whenever defects get filed. And based on their own reporting, 42% of the time they ended up adopting the fix that it recommended, and in 9% of cases it made a semantically identical fix to what a senior developer would have done.
I'm starting to try to imagine. That's I'm trying to imagine what some of like the AI tool sets, specifically for QA and for your roles, are going to look like, not necessarily for companies like Facebook and Microsoft, right? But like smaller companies, like, some local, I don't know, retailer, right? How are they going to use AI tools to help with the QA process? Is it going to be some kind of join point between requirements, right? Like here's Jira, here's code, and then here's a model that we can train with both sides of that. Seek out like uncovered areas in the code for what you were talking about, the behavior-driven tests. Is that going to be a thing? Is it a thing already? And I bury my head in the sand when it comes to new technology sometimes. So
it is a thing that people are still eking and fleshing out. So like just with code, like with QA, like in really every industry that's now forced to adapt to generative AI, is like there's people trying to figure out the best ways to do it. Some people are coming to the conclusion that we need to kind of get to the end result. What are we end generating? So in the example of the art world, that's like, how are we generating the end art versus how are we generating a texture, like in Facebook's tool, to be part of the process of creating art. The same thing is happening in the test space, where it's like, how are we using this to generate test cases in the first place versus how can we use it to help with the test process. So an example of that, another model of testing or a different pattern of testing that we're seeing people adopt is model-based testing, which is essentially not even necessarily using generative tools, but generative tools would lend itself really well to this. Being able to say, take the model of the API that we're working and generating with, and then using something like ChatGPT to write Postman collections for that, automatically just pumping in, aggregate data that it can just generate. And that's another big thing as well too, test data management, and companies that are using PHI compliant, HIPAA compliant PHI. If you need to have synthetic rich data, like richly synthetic data that you can use to drive that stuff, generative AI is a godsend in being able to generate a vast amount of quantitative, valuable data, whereas previously they just had to try and mask production data. There's risks of not doing it well enough, or you end up masking it in a way that it's no longer usable. Like Jerry Smith is now a bunch of asterisks and exclamation points because he had to change the names. Like, I don't know how to look for this. This is now not functional for me as a QA user trying to just look for somebody when I now have to take 10 minutes to type out a string for this person's name now. So, that's another way.
That's a really interesting point, because I know that has been a problem at more than one client that I've been at, where we're like, oh, we need test data. Okay, well, you can't have production because of PHI, but you can't make up test data that's wrong, and you can't use production to make up test data. So, yeah, it sounds like a good use of generative AI to get something that's useful. And generative AI, do you think is going to come up with sort of the classic QA joke where, I walks into the bar and orders -1 or something like that?
Yeah. And I think that what some of these tools like Bug Lab and stuff like that, they do that exceptionally well. And it's going about it trying to, again, solve the problem of deficiencies in the code or ways that things are programmed. And that's still only one piece of the puzzle. Because again, there's still also defects where the implementation and how we're setting it up and the scale of it just wasn't architected correctly. It could be as functionally sound as possible, but it just wasn't meant to scale to where you're putting it.
It only holds 3 people, and that's plenty for our testing.
Exactly. Or it could just be, again, like the requirements at the very beginning weren't clearly defined enough. So yeah, it meets requirements, but were those requirements sound in the first place? If you don't have your processes at the very beginning well enough there, I mean, you could just go through the process of going all the way through the development cycle, all the way releasing it out to production, getting it to the end user. They don't like it because you didn't do enough work to figure out if like that's what they really want. And now you just wasted all that, and that's a huge amount of rework you have to do. And no amount of generative looking over your code and things like that is going to necessarily solve that, because that's a design issue first and foremost that you have to solve with design and not with code. So that's why I think that quality, and especially the quality expert, and I want to, as an industry, drop manual tester and really pick up quality expert, because that is always going to be a role in the quality space. There's always going to need to be that subject matter expert that can help really tailor what these test cases mean. Even if we as an industry decide to adopt, we're going to generate a whole bunch of test cases, there needs to be somebody there to make sense of that. There's going to be no way that's going to be self-descriptive and like traceable back to requirements. Traceability back to requirements is one of the biggest struggles that the industry has right now. And so without having that expert there to really feed that expert knowledge into whatever model you're trying to use for that, it's just not going to be able to perform well enough to really do what you need it to.
So having an AI sit at the typewriter and generate the works of Shakespeare is not necessarily going to be beneficial to testing. You need to find out which pieces actually test your code properly.
Yeah.
And what's waste of time, right? Mm-hmm. It's just run for 10 minutes, but produces no valuable result is not really success, right?
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a good point too, because I mean, what's the average lifespan or career span of an employee at a company in a role, right? Like it's, I think 3 to 5 years. And so if we can transfer some of that, what you're saying, Akila, like where we can transfer some of that knowledge from a person to an AI, right? That can actually tie some of these things together. That AI likely isn't going to get up and walk out the door and quit after a few years. If it does, that's a problem. But it could be a really great use
Terminator
case.
scenario.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. The Terminator scenario.
Robot dogs.
It would be a great use case for accelerating the adoption of some of this stuff. We deal with all the time that have massive domain problems, right? And then they have domain experts within different silos of these domains, and then those domain experts kind of move around and they get promoted and they go to other places, and then you lose. There's this vacuum of knowledge that that potentially, we could surface in other places more effectively.
Well, I think looking from what I know about QA, from the last 15, 20 years, is that role has changed. But there was a point where automated QA became a thing and people had to cross that knowledge gap, and not everybody did. So I'm guessing that shrunk the pool of QA people. Has that been replenished?
It really hasn't. And it's been a thing that's continued to grow. Based on LinkedIn's data from 2020, I want to pull more recent data from this, but in 2020, at least, they had 200,000 open QA positions in the world, and they had 60,000 of those in the US alone. And those were just open QA positions that were just not filled, and a lot of those were for more senior roles that just there isn't the expertise out there in the marketplace for. And so we've seen seen the industry try and find different solutions to move around that. That's been picking up more user acceptance testing, which is great, but also expensive because that happens very late in the development cycle.
Right.
And also more of it has been shifted left just onto dev, but that also doesn't necessarily solve all the problems if your devs are ending up quality checking their own code and they're only checking it at the mindset of the unit or component test, and you're really missing that acceptance or end-to-end layer of testing. And some other companies, Google for one, they started their open source software vulnerability reward program. That's essentially a bug bounty program for all of the open source code that they manage. And so they've just turned to bug bounty hunters. Open source just having, hey, if you find a bug, we'll pay you for it up to $30K. And they've paid out over $38 million so far to 13,000 different bug bounty hunters. So some companies are just having to go to like this new burgeoning industry of bug bounty hunting. I mean, that's been a thing for security vulnerabilities, but now it's kind of a thing where companies are looking to say, just here's some of our source code that we'd like you to QA and find defects on, and they'll just open bounty programs on, which is just another way that the industry is looking to try and solve this huge gap in skill.
I'm trying to do the math for the payout versus the number of bounty hunters. It seems like they're getting a lot of money. Like some of them are probably doing pretty well, like full-time job.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you know what you're doing well enough, like, and if you were an ex-Google employee that like really knew that stuff or had worked on those packages even, I think it'd probably be a good hustle digging into that.
So how does one like become that quality expert, that QE that you're talking about? What kind of roles? Somebody is kind of stuck and not finding enough work in whatever they do in their industry. What kinds of technologists could transfer into that role?
Yeah. It does go to say that less than 20% actually train to end up being a quality role. So there's really not like a formalized path to follow into it. Most of it is people coming in and just learning it on the job as they do it. And most of it is stepping into that role, coming from generally a less technical role. So either coming in from like customer service or doing things like I'm always on the phone dealing with, angry grandmas yelling at me that the website's not working and I got really good writing bug defects for them. And now there's an opening in the QA position. I'm going to try and apply to that and move over to that. That was my story of how I kind of got going in through that a little bit. So much so that I got so good at writing bug defects, I was not even just applied. They said, hey, you're applying. We want you on the team because you keep doing a really good job. Or also coming in from the product side, or just being a business analyst and really seeing the need or the value of it and moving in from that way. So most of it has been really just people coming in from more knowledge centric or like product knowledge centric kind of roles stepping into it that really don't necessarily want to pick up the technical skill aspect of it of learning how to code. And I think that the quality engineer role has started to look a little bit different, where there's been a lot of people that have come over from the quality expert role, picked up the engineering side and started to teach themselves coding and all that. But we're also starting to see with the increased amount of quality work going under dev, that there's starting to be more rigor and discipline put behind the coding and design patterns, more modernization to those instead of just the industry standard of page object model for the past 20 years. So there's been a little bit more of a sharpening of the expertise as far as that goes, just because there's now more people sharing knowledge in that space. And so that one still ends up looking a little bit more traditional. Typically, it is still self-taught coders. I'm still a self-taught coder and all that. But it is starting to look at least a little bit more formal in that. And there is more people stepping into that and picking and saying, I want to be a quality developer versus a normal developer, which is kind of a wild thing to say because that wouldn't have been the case just a handful of years ago.
Yeah, there really isn't a direct college career path of, at the end, you will be developing QA testing software, to test products. And I honestly, in in those kinds of programs, QA probably isn't even a thought. It's all about developing and how to become a developer, and not about how to test your code after you're done or anything like that. Although it's probably changed in my lifetime since I'm so old. But yeah, you're right. I think the classic path that you took is probably the best end game that we could hope for, right? Because you get the empathy from talking to the people, and you do get the ability to describe the problem in such a way that some developer can even read it and figure out what happened to produce that problem, which, oftentimes is like, well, it's broken. Well, tell me how it's broken.
Is there still a time in this whole process where you need a human to sit down, get in front of it, and try to break it?
Yes, I think that there is still always a need for some exploratory testing, because part of exploratory testing is really understanding that our customers are dumb. It's funny as that sounds.
Inexperienced.
Honestly, and that was the running joke at one of the places that I worked at when we did do exploratory testing, because we would try and break it by doing extraordinarily dumb things. I am adding a quantity of 9 million of this to the cart, and we did that because at some point somebody tried.
Might as well try, right?
Uploading something that ended up being like a file that was like 3 petabytes or something like that, because they just tried to upscale the image on Photoshop by just like adding a bunch of zeros on either of the things. And
I think that it's really easy for anyone like hopping on a new system. If you're not dumb, like, you're lucky. We're all dumb when we start out with that kind of stuff and figuring out how to use it.
And I say dumb lovingly, because I've also made plenty of mistakes going to websites.
Right.
Like, why isn't this working? And they go, oh, that's why I should have thought about this just a second longer.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, so Akila, I'm still stuck on, all the new technology coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Are you already thinking about, like, okay, as a QA professional, and I'm stuck on AI because I got sucked into the rabbit hole and now that's where I live. What does a QA process for AI look like? Have you thought about, like, what are we actually going to, how am I going to tell people that, yes, this model is, this generative model is producing great answers, great conversation, blah, blah, blah. I play with it constantly, and I can tell you that the output currently is absolute horror. It sounds like wonderful horror. I mean, it smells pretty, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But it is not factually correct, which I don't think is the point right now.
Yeah.
But it is directionally, you can see the path where it's going. So I want to know that technology set and that entire suite of technology, right?
Mm-hmm.
ML models, the output of them, the generative output, all that stuff. Like, what does the QA process for that look like in your world now? Because it seems like there's a chaos factor there that's going to be hard for you folks to account for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is stuff that I am planning for. I typically have a model of kind of like 4 levels of quality maturity that I rate different clients on. And I'm now adding a 5th layer that is the layer where you can actually successfully implement, various different machine learning algorithms and what they end up doing for you. And I really like to, when I start talking about the granular specifics of that, like to remove AI out of that, because at this point we're talking about specific algorithms doing specific things. And also, I put that at the 5th level of maturity because you put that in after you've planned for it everything below, because you can't just slot it in and run for it and it's now solved everything. It's not a magic bullet. But if it's fit to a model, it does very well. So what does that actually look like? Well, let's talk about at the smallest level, at our unit tests. Start using GitHub Copilot or something like that to help you generate unit tests. It can do that pretty dang gone well, and that's something that you can start doing to just automatically speed that process up. Through design, you should have those requirements or those unit tests tied to a requirement through TDD. Have it set to a PBI, have some sort of requirement you can do that to, and have that linkable. Have some way to have that work item wherever it is and that unit test linkable. Because once we start adding in AI at the very end for the maintenance of stuff and understanding requirements as they evolve, keeping that as a living entity, a living requirement that's linked together is important. So it doesn't just get lost into the space of nothingness. When we start looking at component testing, we can start looking at different ways we can implement that to speed that up. We have, an API that we built, so we have the model for it, and we know a little bit of the data for it. Using that to generate postman collections, so we can automate, and speed up, building the testing that we need to do for it. That just speeds that process up, and it can help speed up the component testing bit and just make that, a little bit more closer to a dev process, a little bit more of a build thing that we can put out and just have is done, in part of the sprint. Steps above that. Once we have the model for the APIs and the data that goes into it, when we start looking at the performance part of it and needing to generate a whole bunch of performance data or test data for performance testing, we can start using the generative tools for like GPT, large language models, to then generate a vast sum of data that we can then feed into those to do the performance testing bit. And we're using that off of the models we've developed in the component testing bit. Stepping up to the next bit, then you're looking at the kind of gherkin layer where you have the acceptance testing, you're writing the test cases, you're in your pickle at that point, and you're writing those test cases down in the given, when, then statements. You're having those tied, again, to the how requirements also in those PBIs. Again, your PBI should be broken down into functional and non-functional requirements. Your functional requirements should be broken down into what of this is functionally what's happening and needs to be done, and how this is providing this value to the business. So that's defining a persona that does a thing to get to an action. You can use large language models if you design and write those initial requirements well enough, and you pair those to your framework of established reusable steps in Gherkin syntax to then essentially rewrite or pre-write those test cases for you. So you're essentially saying, here are my requirements. Here's the suite of steps that we can do, the inventory of test functions we can do, and automatically just write test cases using those suite of functions. And if there's something new we need to add to that, it'll highlight those out. A quality engineer can then go add in those few new steps, and then boom, we now have acceptance testing that can be done in Sprint as well too. Now,
can I
go
jump
ahead.
in?
Yeah.
Remind me again what PBI stands for.
Product backlog item. Sorry, I'm currently working in the Azure stack, so that would be just a normal work item or a requirement in the Jira side. Sorry, cool. I'm in 100% Azure world, so that's what they call it in PBI world.
Step 5.
Yeah.
I'm starting to get the impression that you might have thought about this a little bit.
Just a tiny bit. A tiny bit.
All right. Cool,
and so, again, with all of these are like pulling in a specific tool at a specific point. Another thing you can do is after these test cases run, you can then start to put in a computer, like a convolutional neural net, to do a computer vision thing to look at the pages to see how they've changed between the test execution. So if a test fails and it's because like a locator moved or something like that, you can automate the test case maintenance of it by updating the selector for it, by using visual testing to see where it's moved and try and identify what has changed and where it's moved to then automatically grab and pull the new selector and then commit that back to the code repository. So another huge Achilles heel of, and everyone likes to joke and say it's my Achilles heel whenever I'm talking about automation. I get that joke all the time, so I'm just going to go ahead and already call that one out. With automation is that like most of the time there's immediate return on investment when you automate your feature testing. Feature testing finishes, it goes into the backlog, and 2 or 3 sprints later, no one remembers it, and then something nearby changes it. That test case is no longer valid. Nobody remembers what it was supposed to do, and then they just kind of rewrite it. That's kind of the cycle of automation, but it still works because you are getting ROI to get that feature testing automated, but the long-term automation savings that you could be making get missed out. One thing that AI can also do pretty well, or machine learning in particular with the convolutional neural net, is being able to look at selectors in your DOM on the page and being able to select a new one if it fails, if you can still tie it to what you're originally doing, like using those Gherkin syntax steps. So that's another way that I'd end up implementing it. But again, that's when you get to the level 5 of your quality strategy.
Is there still resistance to even doing QA in the first place?
Yes.
How do you overcome that?
Talking about the value of it, and like a lot of the times, the resistance that I get is people really leaning into the Agile manifesto of saying like, we just build, we meet the requirements for what we're developing, and it passes, we've meet the definition of done, and we're just going to keep setting series of that. And so long as we do that, we're fine. But that really builds in the assumption that you're capturing everything that's going out and you're really able to keep on top of the scale of things. It also assumes that you're able to keep a well enough record and that you're able to maintain good product knowledge. We've mentioned people roll off projects all the time. The actual functional impact of that is that the long-term maintainability of the solution tanks if you don't do quality and you don't have traceability, because people move off the project. 3 weeks later, everybody's thinking about something new, the always brand new, and it's always so small that people just do it, complete it, out of the way. And then when you have to end up hitting things later and later down the line, that's when the rework and the amount of time that gets sunk into that really starts to show. Most of the times when I come into this, I make some of those arguments and I try to do my best to articulate those and give some charts and things like that. But a lot of the times people do not see that immediately. And it's typically, like I said, a 6-month timer when I first come in. And then they go, all right, we like your opinion. We'll think on it. And then 6 months later, when they're reworking some of the stuff I originally told them they were going to, then they go, okay, yeah, we need to do quality. How can we implement this and do this now?
So I just know that I've felt quite a bit of pain in my career because of QAing my own stuff or just not having accurate use cases. We QA'd something with 5 people and it worked great. And 100 people hit it when I went into production and we had the big launch. We spent that week fixing it. And it's like, that's the kind of pain and suffering. And if we had that person in there to say, well, you should probably do this too, would have made a big difference.
Yeah.
I see the impact of my sloppy configuration and development work. And then I shore things up and fix it and stuff. And then a lot of that's iterative where I'm trying to get something done in a hurry. Yeah, I probably need a QA person just to sit next to me and point out everything that needs to be tested.
Yeah.
That's a use case. Yeah.
And I mean, there's also Moore's Law with that as well, too. If something can go wrong, it will. So
yeah,
that's always a
absolutely.
good reason to have a QA on hand.
I did do a lot of QA over something I built over Christmas, and I'm so glad I did. I didn't realize that somebody would put a negative value that box that was 25 characters long, giving them an extra 1,000 hours of PTO they could carry over. I'm like, okay, that's bad. Probably shouldn't do that. Thanks, Michael Aldrich. If you're out there, you saved me.
So Akila, you mentioned 5 different levels. Where are most clients starting from when you walk in the door?
Level 1. And I started with level 0, so it's kind of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So no, I started at an index of 0. I'm kind of over in that mind. Because level 0 is I'm coming in there, they don't have anything written down. They're doing everything by gut checks. Deployments are all manual. They don't have really anything in pipelines, and there really isn't much good coordination between like dev and QA. And that I've been in at a few level 0s, and I've walked them up through to the level 3, which is like having everything in pipelines, test data management, executing on a per test execution basis, atomically tied to that test case in a manner that is not going to sanitize or contaminate other test cases, and all those can run in parallel. And those are linked to the original work item or requirement that originated them. So as soon as that runs, the application state is captured. It can supply its own test data. It can deploy itself, run, and then report that back. And so you know that requirement is valid pretty much at any point in time.
Is that like taking them from 0 to 3? Is that
was
like
a 3-year journey?
Is that like priming the pump where they're gonna take it from there and get to the 5 just from knowing that they need to do that stuff?
I mean, so really to get to that point, you really have to plan for it at the beginning. So like one of the things that I'll get as a pushback like against doing more things for QA is people saying, we'll just build there. Well, we can just keep bolting on sprint by sprint and get and I feel like you really can't in this regard get to that level of maturity without planning for it at the beginning, because when you start looking at each of those individual aspects of like, all right, how are we sending test results back to the work items, and that customization there of like how we're going to like even like get those together, That's a lot of rework that has to happen much later in the game when you have a huge suite of test cases if you did not plan for it from the beginning.
Right.
And that's a lot of stuff that gets missed out because, again, if a developer is picking this up or just someone from the architecture team, they'll get their little bit of it really great, but then they'll completely miss on the requirement part of it. And that disconnect is kind of really where a lot of those gaps come out. So if I can get them to a level 3 point, they're pretty much good on their own and they can keep managing things well. And then they can then start adding in some of the other stuff later. But really getting that strategy in that first place where you can really set the kind of like compass and get going is important. If I could share just like one small little story with this. So when I was in the military, we were doing a fun training where we were overnight just doing a hiking. We had to get to a particular point. And like through that, you had to like kind of set your compass, go for a little bit, adjust it and whatnot. I was hiking with somebody that I trusted with a compass that I should not have and had us pointed 5 degrees off for like a 3-hour hike for just a little bit too long. And the distance of that ended, like I can't remember the exact distance of what that would be, but it ended up putting us like an hour and a half way off of track just because we were a tiny bit of a degree not exactly where we needed to go. And then we had to double back and end up crossing back a lot of distance, essentially. When you end up just trying to solve this by bolting on things sprint by sprint, you end up going in this little direction, and then you start going in this direction, and then you start going in this direction, and then you end up jumping left and right everywhere and not keeping really on point to where you're going, and it ends up taking you a whole lot longer than if you really thought far ahead about where you want to go and just went in a straight line there. And so I think that when you really start planning your quality strategy, you really need to do that, or else you're really going to end up spending a lot of time doubling back.
The odds of you getting that 5 degrees every time at all the steps along the way is almost zero, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're going to be off at the end.
Yeah. We're coming down to the end. I feel
That
like
sounds like as good of a parting thought as we're going to get, Kyle.
Yeah. And I'll just, to pile onto that, I have said, yeah, we're in Canada. I think we should have gone to that other portage. So that has happened to me. But I feel like there's so much more we could dig into with this topic. So
Yeah.
I'm hoping we can have you back soon and do a part 2 that might lead to a part 3. I don't know. But until then, I think we'll say goodbye, everybody.
Yeah,
Goodbye.
Thank you all so much.
See you later.
Goodbye. Thanks for being here.
Thank all you listeners for being here.
Yes.
It's mostly our moms, I think.
All right. Stop.
Solution Design Group is a digital product consultancy in Minneapolis. Check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com or look for us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.